Hey everybody, welcome to More. If you were with us on Sunday at one of our locations or even online, you know that we are starting a 4-week period of time, a series, if you will, that is specific to each location. Each of our location pastors picking their own topic, developing their own message series or a series of messages. And so what do we do with More? Because More usually follows that pattern from those messages preached across our locations. And so as I was praying about it and thinking about it, I thought maybe we could invest our time, because I know many of you use this as a personal devotion and others use this for their groups or their group time. So what could we bring to the table that is beneficial for us? And I wanted to spend the next 4 weeks unpacking this conversation, the importance of worship. The importance of worship. I think we understand that worship is important, but I think sometimes we maybe misidentify that, or maybe even at times find ourselves in worship situations or things we call worship, and we wonder what we're supposed to do or how we're supposed to accomplish that, or what the purpose, the why of it all is. For a lot of Christians, I think the idea of coming together, singing, praying, listening to a message kind of checks the worship box. But what about in between those moments? And even if we're just checking a box, have we truly worshiped? So let me just start today by kind of outlining kind of a big idea of all of this. And then with the questions that follow, give you some time to kind of start unpacking that. And then over the course of the few weeks that will follow, we'll dig a little deeper into some of these specific things and some other things that hopefully will yield to us a greater understanding or greater desire of worship. I think it's an amazing thing that worship really was the primary command that God has given to man. I don't think we always recognize that. Let me show you. This is such a familiar verse. We've talked about it in so many different contexts, but Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5 is really the foundational moment in teaching that Moses gave to the Israelites. It is something that they were to teach their children and pass on generationally. And this is what Deuteronomy 6:5 says. Love God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Love God with all your heart, soul, and strength. And really, if you stop and really pause there and think about that, well, what does it mean to love God? I think by loving God with our whole being, our heart, soul, strength, and even Jesus would talk about this as the greatest commandment in the New Testament. I think when we choose to love God, when we intentionally choose to love God with our whole being, when we obey Him, and we develop in that opportunity ways to worship Him. What does that mean? What do I mean by that? Well, let me see if I can maybe illustrate that in a couple of ways. First, let me illustrate that with really what the pattern was in the Old Testament. When you read through the Old Testament and all the stories of the Old Testament, when you look at the people and the situations they find themselves in, I think you find very, very quickly that worship was the pattern of their lives. If they were walking with God, worship was central to what they were doing and how they kept their walk maintained and healthy and growing. Think about it like this. God designed the worship center Himself. If we go to the Old Testament and we look at the instructions God gave Moses about building the tabernacle, He gave him very specific instructions, detailed instructions, down to the precise measurements for everything, from the outer covering to the inner tent, to the utensils, to the mercy seat, to all of those things. It was very, very specific. In fact, I find this fascinating. It takes 7 chapters for Him to describe how He wanted it built. Isn't that amazing? And it was to go with them wherever they went. If they needed to move camp, they took it all down, gathered it all up in a very particular way, and moved to another camp. And when they reestablished camp, the tabernacle was the center of the camp for God's people. It was really His way of showing the people that worship was to be their way of life. And you can read on and see so many instances of how worship permeated everything they did as a nation, as a people, as followers of God. That was the Old Testament pattern. I think that we can look beyond that now and see that even in the New Testament, that pattern was followed. First in the life of Jesus and then in the life of the church. For Jesus, if you look throughout his ministry, over and over and over again, worship was focused either on him or he was focused in worship. And so let me just take you through one chapter or one book, just look at the book of Matthew, if you would. All the way through the book of Matthew, worship, 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 worship. It permeates everything that happens. Let me just give some of these, and I'm not going to read them here, but I will drop them into your notes on our Facebook page, our website page. Think about this: Matthew chapter 2, verse 11. The wise men, the Magi, come into the home where Jesus and his parents are living at that time, and they did what? They worshiped him. Matthew chapter 8, verse 2, he heals the leper, and the leper worships him. Matthew chapter 9, verse 18, describes a certain ruler who was there to worship. Matthew 15, 25, a woman who is worshiping him. Matthew 14, 33, as he walks on water, the waves and the wind worship him. Matthew 28, verse 17, they gather on a mountaintop, and there they are worshiping. And that's just one book. We could go on and on and on, and we find the church singing and praising God, writing new songs and gathering together for worship over and over again, all the way into eternity in Revelation chapter 15, where even there in heaven, gathered around the throne, the worship of God will never cease. They'll continually praise him 24 hours a day. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. It's an incredible thought that all the way through the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, this practice of worship is given to us, is illustrated to us, is modeled for us, emphasizing the importance of worship. I think if you really think about it, it really then becomes important for us to gather this truth into our minds that our primary responsibility as followers of God is to worship him. Psalm 27 verse 4 says, "One thing I desire to the Lord, that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple." What was David's desire? To spend all the days of his life, in worship to a holy God. And what is the result of that? The result of that is God desires to be with us in our worship. Psalm 22:3 says that God inhabits the praises of his people. In other words, that he lives in the midst of our praise. It's where God is at home in our worship. Sure, God exists everywhere, but he's not manifested everywhere. I love how C.S. Lewis said this. He said, "It is the presence of being worshiped that God communicates his presence to men. Even in Judaism, the essence of the sacrifice was not really that men give bulls and goats to God, but that by their so doing, God gave himself to men." Wow. Isn't that powerful? One last thought that I would say to you is this. Some people would say, well, what about all the things we do for God? I think that if we're going to be effective in our service, it starts with the prerequisite that we worship. More important to worship than serve? I think there's an argument to be made there. I think there's something to be said that the one you worship is the one you serve. It starts with worship and then moves to service. Oswald Chambers, the great devotional writer, "My Utmost for His Highest," said this: "If you have not been worshiping, when you get to work, you'll not only be useless, but a tremendous hindrance." That's powerful, isn't it? Well, we're out of time today, but what I hope to do is begin opening this conversation with you about the importance of worship. We've seen that as the primary command, and then the pattern really modeled for us in the Old and New Testaments, the place where God desires to be in our worship and how when we worship, we become effective to serve. Next week, we'll continue this conversation, digging a little deeper and spending a little more time. All these texts that I mentioned, Bible texts I mentioned, will be in the questions and some questions to follow. Can't wait to spend these 4 weeks with you talking about the importance of worship. So we'll see you next time here at More. God bless.